The night Garrett Malone walked into the Harbor Light Diner, every waitress on shift found a reason to be somewhere else. Not Fiona Doyle. Fiona had worked the late shift at Harbor Light for 3 years, long enough to recognize the kind of man who makes a room go quiet the moment he enters. She had seen bikers, she had seen debt collectors, she had seen the kind of men who wear expensive watches and cheaper smiles. But Garrett Malone was something else entirely. He moved through the door like the cold air outside had sent him in as an advanced scout, and the diner, all flickering fluorescent light and cracked vinyl booths, seemed to shrink around him. He sat at the counter, not a booth, not a table by the window. The counter where he could see the door and everyone in it. Fiona picked up her order pad. Before we go any further, if you're new here, welcome to Lily's Romance Library. Hit that subscribe button because this one is going to stay with you, and for those of you who've been here before, you already know what's coming is not what you expect. Now let's get into it. The rain had been relentless all week in Halifax, the kind of October rain that doesn't commit to being dramatic. It just persists, gray and indifferent, soaking into everything. The harbor smelled like brine and diesel, and the fishing boats that lined the wharf had been sitting idle since Tuesday. Harbor Light sat at the edge of the waterfront district, wedged between a closed bait shop and a laundromat that kept its lights on at all hours. It was the kind of place that survived, not because it was good, but because it was there. Open at midnight when nothing else was, serving coffee strong enough to dissolve a spoon. Garrett Malone ordered black coffee. Didn't look at the menu. Kitchen's still open if you want something warm, Fiona said. Her voice was even. She had learned a long time ago that the worst thing you could do with a man like this was let him see your hands shake. Just coffee. She poured it. He watched the door. Fiona was 26. She had grown up in Dartmouth, across the bridge, in one of those neighborhoods where you learned early which shortcuts were safe and which ones weren't. She had a practical face, not plain, but the kind of pretty that doesn't advertise itself. Dark hair pulled back. Ink stain on her left thumb from the crossword she'd been doing before he came in. She noticed things. It was a habit she'd developed young, in a house where noticing things early was the difference between a quiet evening and a loud one. She noticed, for instance, that Garrett Malone's jacket was wet at the shoulder but dry at the sleeve. He'd been standing in the rain, standing still, not walking through it, watching something. She also noticed the girl. She came in 12 minutes after he did. Small, maybe 9 years old, wearing a yellow raincoat 2 sizes too large, and carrying a backpack that seemed to be doing most of the work of keeping her upright. She stood in the doorway and looked around the diner with the careful, measuring expression of a child who has learned not to trust her first read of a room. Her eyes found Fiona first. Kids always find the safest person in a room. Fiona didn't know why that was, but she had come to accept it as fact. The girl walked to the counter, bypassing every empty booth, and sat down 2 stools from Garrett Malone. She unzipped her backpack, took out a notebook, and opened it to a page covered in careful, looping handwriting. Then she looked up at Fiona and said very quietly, "Can I have hot chocolate, please? I have $4. Hot chocolate's $3.50, Fiona said. You've got 50 cents left over. You want a cookie with that?" The girl considered this with the gravity it deserved. "Yes, please." Garrett Malone had not looked at the girl, but he had stopped watching the door. Fiona set the hot chocolate down and went to get the cookie from the glass case at the end of the counter. When she turned back, she saw it, fast, practiced, almost invisible. The girl had knocked her notebook off the counter. Reaching to catch it, she had bumped Fiona's jacket, which was hanging on the hook behind the counter stool. The small zippered pocket on the front flap fell open. Fiona's emergency cash, $40 she kept folded there for cab fare home on rough nights, was gone. She looked at the girl. The girl was looking at her notebook. Her face was completely still. Here is where most people would have made a scene. Called the girl out, raised their voice, made an example. Here is where the sensible thing was to involve someone else. The other waitress in the back, the cook, maybe call the non-emergency police line. Fiona did none of these things. Instead, she leaned on the counter, lowered her voice to the level of a secret, and said, "Honey, whatever you needed that for, I hope it's worth it. But I want you to know, if you needed help, You could have just asked. The girl's carefully neutral face cracked, just slightly, at the edges. And that was the moment Garrett Malone looked up. He had been watching the entire exchange in the reflection of the dark window behind the counter. He was looking now not at the girl but at Fiona, the way a man looks at something that does not fit the map he has been using. "How much did she take?" he asked. "None of your business," Fiona said, without looking at him. A beat. Then, from somewhere behind that granite expression, something shifted. It wasn't a smile, not quite. But it was the shape of one, somewhere underneath. He put a folded bill on the counter. "For her hot chocolate. Her hot chocolate is covered," Fiona said. "Then for yours." He left before she could respond. He left his coffee unfinished, which struck her as the strangest part of the whole thing, because men like that do not leave things unfinished. The girl watched him go. Then she reached into her raincoat pocket and put Fiona's $40 on the counter. "He's not bad," the girl said. "Very matter of fact. He just looks like he is." And that, as they say, is where the story should have ended. It didn't. Garrett Malone's real name was not something most people in Halifax knew, or were alive to repeat if they did. He had been born in Cape Breton, in a town that doesn't appear on tourist maps, to a father who ran the eastern corridor of what passed for organized crime on the Atlantic coast, a quieter, more bureaucratic kind of brutality than the cinematic version, but no less effective. His father, Patrick Malone, had built an empire on port logistics. What came in, what went out, who knew about it? He had died 8 years ago in what the police report called a workplace accident, and what everyone else understood to be a message. Garrett had inherited the business and the enemies. He had not inherited his father's taste for cruelty, which was both an asset and a liability depending on who you asked. He was precise. He was patient. He had a particular talent for understanding, before anyone else in the room, exactly when a situation was about to go wrong. He had been watching the Harbor Light Diner for 6 days before he walked in. Not because of Fiona Doyle. Because of the man in the navy blue sedan who had been parked across the street for the same 6 days, and who Garrett had traced back, through 2 shell companies and one very uncomfortable conversation, in a parking garage in Dartmouth, to a name he recognized. The name was Vincent Cray. Vincent Cray had been his father's logistics manager for 11 years. He had, also Garrett, had recently discovered been quietly selling information to a rival network operating out of Montreal, and had been doing so since approximately 3 months before Patrick Malone's workplace accident. This was, to put it plainly, a problem. The secondary problem, the one that had Garrett sitting at a diner counter in the rain watching a child steal $40 from a waitress, was that Vincent Cray appeared to be watching the girl. He had followed her here. Garrett had watched him do it. He did not know why a mid-level criminal accountant with blood on his hands was surveilling a 9-year-old in a yellow raincoat. He was going to find out. The girl's name was Audrey. Fiona learned this over the next 40 minutes, during which Audrey finished her hot chocolate, ate her cookie, and, when Fiona's shift slowed to a crawl around 1 in the morning, sat at the counter and talked. She was 9. She lived, she said, with her gran on Agricola Street. Her gran had been in the hospital since Tuesday, a fall, nothing life-threatening, but she wouldn't be home until Friday. Audrey had been staying with a neighbor, Mrs. Penny, who was 73, and fell asleep at 8 o'clock and didn't notice when Audrey left. "You've been on your own since Tuesday?" Fiona asked. "Mrs. Penny makes soup," Audrey said, which was not a yes but was not a no. "The $40, Fiona said carefully. "What was that for?" Audrey looked at her notebook. "There's a man," she said. "He's been sitting outside our building since Tuesday. He moves his car, but he's always there. And Gran's not home, and Mrs. Penny doesn't drive. And I thought if I had enough money I could take a cab to the hospital and tell Gran, because Gran always knows what to do." Fiona felt something cold settle in her chest. "What does this man look like?" Audrey described a navy blue sedan. Fiona put her pen down. She called the one person she thought might actually be able to help. Her older brother Declan, who worked nights at a garage on Roby Street and had a particular gift for showing up when things went sideways. He didn't answer. She tried twice, voicemail both times. She was still looking at her phone when the bell above the door rang. Not the girl's stalker. Worse, or better, depending on how the next hour went. Garrett Malone. He had changed his jacket. This one was dry. He sat back down at the counter, looked at Audrey, then at Fiona. "The man in the Navy sedan," he said, with no preamble at all. "His name is Vincent Cray. He's not after you." He looked at the girl. "He's after what your grandmother has." The silence in the diner had a specific texture to it. The cook had gone home, the other waitress was out back on her break, and the rain against the window was the only sound. Fiona became aware, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that they were very much alone. "How do you know about my grandmother?" Audrey said. Garrett looked at her with something that was not quite respect and not quite surprise, but was clearly a recalibration. "Because I know Vincent Cray, and I know what he's looking for." This is the moment in every story where the sensible person says, "I don't want to know," and calls the police and goes home. And if you've been watching this channel for any length of time, you know that nobody in these stories is entirely sensible. But you also know that Fiona Doyle, who had grown up reading Exits, who kept $40 in a hidden pocket for reasons, who had served the wrong kind of men for 3 years without ever once giving one of them an inch. Fiona was not foolish. She was careful. "Start from the beginning," she said, "and don't leave anything out." Garrett looked at her for a moment. Then he did something she didn't expect. He started from the beginning. Audrey's grandmother was named Ruth Hennessy. Ruth Hennessy had worked for Patrick Malone for 14 years, not in the criminal operations. She had been his personal bookkeeper, the legitimate side of the ledger, meticulous and invisible. She was 67, arthritic, and had a memory for numbers that bordered on the supernatural. She had also, Garrett explained, kept copies. Not copies of the criminal accounts. She wouldn't have had access to those. But copies of the legitimate financials, cross-referenced against the dates of Patrick Malone's death and the sudden, suspicious transfer of assets that followed it. Assets that had gone, Garrett had eventually traced, to an account controlled by Vincent Cray. Ruth Hennessy had figured it out. Not all of it, but enough. Enough that she had quietly put the documents somewhere safe and spent the last 8 years saying nothing because she had a granddaughter, and she understood clearly what saying something would cost. And then, 3 weeks ago, she had made one phone call. To Garrett. She had told him what she knew. She had told him where the documents were. She had not told him that Vincent Cray had a source inside the phone carrier who had flagged the call. "She called you," Fiona said slowly. "And 3 weeks later she fell." "The fall was real," Garrett said. "I've had someone at the hospital since Wednesday, but Cray was already watching the building before that. He knows she has something. He doesn't know where it is." "Where is it?" Fiona asked. Garrett looked at Audrey. Audrey, who had been listening to all of this with the focused attention of someone who has been quietly putting pieces together, opened her notebook. Not the page covered in handwriting. She flipped to the back, the inside back cover, where a child's careful hand had taped a small cream envelope. "Gran gave me this," she said. "Last Christmas. She said it was a letter to keep. She said I'd know when it was time." She held it out to Garrett. He didn't take it immediately. He looked at it the way people look at things that cost more than they want to pay. "You should know," he said to Audrey, and his voice had dropped to something that was entirely different from the way he'd spoken before. Something quieter and more real. "That your grandmother is the reason I know what happened to my father. She didn't have to make that call. She had every reason not to. She did it anyway." Audrey considered this. "She says the truth has a weight," she said, "and if you carry it too long, it bends you." Neither adult said anything for a moment. Garrett took the envelope. Inside was not, as Fiona had half expected, some dramatic final document. It was a key, a small standard brass key, and a piece of paper with an address in Dartmouth and a locker number written in Ruth Hennessy's precise, architectural handwriting, and beneath the address, in smaller letters, "For Garrett when he's ready. Tell him his father was proud of him. He told me so himself. R." Garrett read it once, folded it, put it in his jacket pocket. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Here is what the comments on videos like this always say. Did he cry? And the honest answer is not in the way you're thinking. But if you looked closely, if you were Fiona Doyle watching a man who had spent 20 years carrying the weight of his father's murder and his father's name and his father's sins, You would have seen something move behind his eyes, like a door that had been sealed for a very long time opening, just slightly, onto a room full of light. Fiona turned to the window. She felt, without fully understanding why, that she should give him a moment. Outside, the navy blue sedan was still there. "He's watching the diner now," she said. "He saw you come in. I know, so what happens next?" Garrett pulled out his phone, made one call, spoke 4 words she didn't catch, and hung up. "In about 11 minutes, he said. "That becomes someone else's problem. Your people. People who owe me a favor, and who have a strong professional interest in what's in that locker." He paused. "They're not police, but they're not the law either. The distinction matters." Fiona looked at him. "And us?" It was a practical question. She genuinely meant it that way. "What do we do for the next 11 minutes? With a child and a sealed locker address, and a man outside who wants what we have." But Garrett heard something else in it, or chose to. He looked at her in the way he had looked at her earlier, in the window reflection, with the expression of a man encountering something that does not fit his map. "That depends," he said, "on whether you want to be involved. Little late for that question. Fair." He looked at Audrey, who had finished reconstructing the envelope very carefully and placed it back inside her notebook. "You did the right thing," he said to her, "coming out tonight, keeping that letter." "I know," Audrey said without false modesty. "Gran said you would come eventually. She said you were the kind of person who takes a long time to start, but always finishes." Something crossed his face that was unmistakably, if briefly, a smile. Outside, 9 minutes later, 2 unmarked cars pulled quietly alongside the Navy sedan. There was no scene, no noise. The kind of resolution that happens the way serious things often do, not with drama but with a certain flat efficiency, like a debt being settled on paper. Vincent Cray did not struggle. Some men, when they are finally cornered by the thing they have spent years running from, simply stop. Garrett watched through the window. Fiona stood beside him. "How long have you known about Cray?" she asked. "Long enough. And the documents? The ones in the locker? What happens to them?" He was quiet for a moment. "They go where they need to go," he said. "My father's name gets cleared. The record reflects what actually happened." He paused. "And then I figure out what I do with the rest of it. The rest of it meaning the business, the network, the thing I've been running for 8 years because there was no one else who could." He turned away from the window. "It's a strange thing to spend your whole life becoming something your father built, and then find out the man who took him from you was someone he trusted completely." Fiona thought about that. "It changes what you inherited," she said. "Both things, the good and the bad." He looked at her. "Yeah, it doesn't have to define what you build next." Another long pause. The rain was finally easing. The harbor, visible through the far window, had gone from black to the particular gray-violet color that comes just before a Nova Scotia dawn. "You're very calm," he said, "for a woman who just spent the night in the middle of something she had no business being in." "I grew up in Dartmouth," she said. "You recalibrate fast or you don't." This time the smile was real, and she saw the full shape of it, and she thought, with the frank pragmatism that was very much a Fiona Doyle's signature, "There it is." Audrey fell asleep in a corner booth at some point. Around 4 in the morning, her yellow raincoat pulled up around her shoulders like a cape. Fiona left her there and stood behind the counter and refilled the coffee she had not drunk, and thought about all the ways this night could have gone differently. She thought about the $40. She thought about a girl in a too large raincoat who had stolen it not for herself, but to get to her grandmother. She thought about what it meant that Ruth Hennessy, a 67-year-old bookkeeper with arthritic hands, had spent 8 years carrying knowledge that could have gotten her killed and had protected it until the right moment, and had then trusted it to her 9-year-old granddaughter, because she understood, intuitively, that Audrey was the safest place for anything precious to be. The truth has a weight, and if you carry it too long, it bends you. Garrett came back to the counter. He had stepped outside to handle something. She hadn't asked what. He sat down. For the first time all night, he looked at the menu. "Kitchen's closed," Fiona said, "but I can make eggs. You don't have to." "I know." She was already moving toward the pass-through window. "How do you like them?" There was a pause. "Scrambled," he said. "Please." The pleas landed like something unexpected in the quiet of the diner. She made eggs. He ate them. Audrey slept. Outside, the harbor light came on. The real one, the lighthouse signal at the end of the eastern breakwater, and cast a slow sweep across the water. At 7 in the morning, a woman named Sandra from the hospital's social work team arrived to sit with Audrey until Ruth Hennessy could be discharged, which would happen, the hospital had confirmed, by noon. Sandra had been called by Garrett. Fiona did not ask how he had arranged it. Some things you accept as the shape of a person rather than a mystery to be solved. Audrey woke up, ate the toast Fiona had made, and gathered her backpack with the focused efficiency of a child who has somewhere to be. At the door, she turned back. She looked at Garrett. "Gran said to tell you," she said, with the deliberateness of someone delivering a message word for word as instructed, "that you were always more than what you were handed." Then she walked out with Sandra, her yellow raincoat brilliant against the gray October morning. The diner was very quiet. Garrett sat with his coffee, the second cup, which Fiona had poured without being asked, and looked at the door for a long moment after Audrey was gone. "She's something," he said finally. "She really is," Fiona said. He left an hour later. No drama, no declaration. He put a business card on the counter, plain, just a number, no name, and said, "For anything you need. If Cray has associates who come asking questions, if anything happens, call that number first." "And if nothing happens?" she asked. He looked at her. "Then call it anyway," he said, "if you want." He walked out into the October morning, and the harbor wind took the door from his hand and swung it shut behind him, and the bell above it rang once, clean and clear, in the empty diner. She called it on a Thursday 3 weeks later, not because anything had happened. Nothing had. The locker documents had gone where they needed to go. She'd read between the lines of a small Halifax Examiner story about a financial fraud case reopened after new evidence emerged. Ruth Hennessy had come home from the hospital. Audrey had started taking the bus to school again without watching over her shoulder. Nothing had happened. She just called. He answered on the second ring. "Harbor Light is closed Thursdays," she said. "I'm making eggs." A pause. "Scrambled," he said, "if you want." He came. And that's the question that stays with you, isn't it? Not whether they ended up together, because you already know the answer to that. The question is, what does it mean when the person who finds you is looking for something else entirely, and you turn out to be the thing they didn't know they needed? What was your moment, the one that started something you didn't see coming? Drop it in the comments. And if this story hit different for you, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one at Lily's Romance Library. We've got more stories where this one came from.